Chapter 9, Fruit. Raj is waiting at the curb. His eyes are fixed on the cars driving up and down the street. My grandfather stops over to him, digging in his backpack. It's my old one from elementary school, and it has kittens on it. I thought it was a little uncool for him, but he told me that it's a perfectly good backpack, and he didn't care what people might think. You, my grandfather shouts. Raj turns, watches us. His eyes flicker to me briefly before returning to my grandfather. My grandfather pulls out the papers and shoves them into Raj's hand. Read 'em and weep, he says. Raj scans them, then he looks up. Most of these were published over 30 years ago. My grandfather is stunned into a momentary silence and then says, Einstein published a long time ago, too. Are you going to poo-poo him? You're being a little ridiculous, Raj says. A compact car pulls up to the curb and a teenager is behind the wheel. He has the same dark eyes as Raj, but looks a few years older. Raj folds his tall frame into the front seat. Ridiculous, huh? My grandfather sputters. What do you know anyway? You're just a kid. Raj leans out of the window, gives my grandfather a slow look. I don't know. You're a kid too, he pauses. What do you know? When we get home, my grandfather heads straight for the kitchen. I'm starving, he says. I heat up some burritos and I say, there's probably not a more perfect combination than rice, refried beans, and cheese. He makes himself a hot cup of tea and goes to go with his burrito. He pours the steaming water into the mug with precision, adds 2 perfect teaspoons of sugar, and methodically stirs the sugar like he's making a formula. It makes me think of the mad scientist conversation. I like what you talked about at lunch, I confess, about science, but where do you start? He looked up from his tea. What do you mean? In a puzzle, I always begin with a straight edge piece. If you wanted to cure polio or anything, where would you even start? With your eyes, of course, he says. Eyes? He looks at a bowl of fruit on the counter. For example, that bowl of fruit. What do you see? He asks. It's a battered wooden bowl. There are a few apples, a banana, some pears, and a mango. I'm pretty sure my mom got the mango on sale because she usually doesn't buy them otherwise. I see a bowl of fruit. Is the fruit dead or alive? He probes. I look more closely. The apples are red and shiny. The banana doesn't have any bruises. Alive? He picks up an apple, turning it. Is it, though? Is it attached to a root system? Is it ingesting nutrients, water? Those are all signs of life. I guess not, I say. He waves the apple at me. It actually begins dying the minute you pick it. Then he goes to the counter and takes a knife from the butcher block. He slices the apple in 2, exposing a neat row of dark brown seeds. Now, he says, touching them with the tip of his knife, what about these? Dead, I guess. This is trickier. They're dormant, waiting. Bury them in soil, give them water and sunlight, and they'll grow. In a way, they're immortal. And they were inside this apple all along. I'm kind of blown away. I thought science was all about experiments in laboratories, I admit. My grandfather shakes his head. The most powerful tool of a scientist is observation. Galileo, the father of modern science, observed Jupiter had moons orbiting it, proving that the Earth was not the center of everything. His observations forced people to think differently about their place in the universe. Then he looks around and says, but now that you've mentioned it, I am going to need a laboratory. For what? For analyzing the T. malvinus when we get it back, of course, he says, like it's obvious. I need to replicate my results if I'm going to publish. I think for a minute. Our house isn't exactly huge. What about the garage, I suggest? We go out to the garage and my father does a slow tour. One half is clear for my mom's car, but the other is stacked with boxes of props from her shows over the years. There's an old workbench that was my dad's, our bikes, and a freezer. My mom likes to stock up on frozen food before she goes into production on a show. My grandfather rubs a non-existent beard on his chin. Electricity, decent lighting. It's not climate controlled, but it could be worse. At least I'm not in a desert like Oppenheimer. I just look at him. Robert Oppenheimer, World War II. We haven't gotten that far in history yet, I explain. We're still on ancient Greece. Robert Oppenheimer was a brilliant physicist. He ran the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer tested the atomic bomb in the middle of the desert in New Mexico. Wow, I say. He looks around. Well, no time like the present. Let's get this place organized. My grandfather wants to set up a lab around the main electricity outlets, and that means shifting all the prop boxes out of the way. It takes us the better part of 2 hours to move everything. There's a box of clip lights, and he rearranges them around the workbench. The garage door slowly rolls open, and my mother's car is there, but she can't pull into the garage because of all of the boxes. She kills the engine and walks into the garage. "What are you two doing?" she demands. "We're setting up a lab," I tell her. "Here in the garage?" So I can continue my research," my grandfather explains. "And exactly where am I supposed to park my car?" she asks. "Outside," I suggest. "I don't think so," she says. My grandfather stares at her. "You're standing in the way of a scientific discovery." "I'm standing in the way of birds pooing on my car." It takes the rest of the afternoon to put everything back. Chapter 10. Salk and Oppenheimer. I'm supposed to do a report on a famous historical figure, but instead of choosing from the likely suspects, William Shakespeare, Thomas Jefferson, Harriet Tubman, I used my computer to look up the names my grandfather's been batting around. Galileo, Jonas Salk, Robert Oppenheimer. Galileo's picture is an old oil painting, like something that should be hanging in the De Young Museum in San Francisco. He's dressed like he's in a Shakespearean play and doesn't seem like a real person. But Salk and Oppenheimer are interesting. Salk looks exactly the way you'd imagine a scientist. Glasses, a white lab coat holding a test tube. Nerdy in general. Oppenheimer is more unexpected. He's handsome with piercing eyes. He stares broodingly into the camera like an old Hollywood actor. In one shot, he's wearing a hat and has a cigarette dangling from his mouth. I can almost imagine my dad playing him in a movie. Also, Oppenheimer has a local connection to the Bay Area. He taught at the University of California in Berkeley. My mom is always raving about the theater program there. I couldn't help but notice the similarities between the two men. They were both involved in wars where science plays a big part in the outcome. Jonas Salk and the war on polio, Robert Oppenheimer and World War II. Salk found a vaccine that prevented polio, and Oppenheimer helped to create the bomb that was dropped on Japan and ended the war. Oppenheimer's story seems especially like a Hollywood movie. The race against the Germans to create the bomb first, and then there's the photo of one of the bombs exploding with a big mushroom cloud. There's a quote from Oppenheimer, his reaction to the successful testing of the atomic bomb. "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried. Most people were silent." I understood how he felt, like when my grandfather walked through the front door looking like a teenager. Science fiction becoming reality. My mom talks about how she couldn't have even imagined cell phones when she was a kid, and now everyone has them, except, well, me, of course. My parents say I'm too young. My grandfather comes into my bedroom without knocking. He freezes when he sees the handprints. "Good grief, what happened to your walls?" "They're supposed to look like that," I explain. "That's a style. Whatever happened to nice wallpaper?" he says. He points to his face. He's totally breaking out. He's got zits on his forehead and a big red one on his chin. "Do you have any acne cream?" "There's some in the bathroom," I tell him, and he follows me in. "I can't believe I'm 76 years old and dealing with pimples again," he grumbles. I dig through the drawer and find a tube, and I hand it to him. He smears the cream on his zits. "Maybe next time I'll find a cure for acne," he says. We order Chinese takeout again for dinner. My mom wanted to order sushi, but my grandfather said a person who has the most degrees should get to choose. Since he has 2 PhDs, he won. As we eat, I find myself observing my grandfather and my mother like I'm a scientist. Even Ellie version of Galileo. For one thing, our whole sitting arrangement is different. When it's just my mom and me, we sit next to each other, but my grandfather sits at the head of the counter like he's the king. Then there's the way they talk to each other, or rather don't talk to each other. My grandfather grills my mom with questions I can tell she finds annoying. Does she still have a college transcripts? Would she like to meet a friend of his from Stanford Biology Department to talk about the program? Would she like his help in applying? She answers him the first few times, but after a while she stops and just looks at her plate, the way a teenager would. I have a sudden realization. Even though my mom's grown up with her own life, my grandfather still treats her like a kid. After we finish dinner, I pass out the fortune cookies. My grandfather doesn't look very happy when he reads his fortune. What does it say? I ask him. You're going to have some new clothes, he says. Well, that's not a bad idea, Dad. Maybe we should go get you some clothes with a little style. You look like you stepped out of an old man department. I could drive you to the mall, my mom offers. There's nothing wrong with my clothes. They're brand new. I bought them just a few weeks ago after I turned young. To me, he says, I had to because I shrank. Then he turns to my mother. But now that you mention it, I do need to borrow the car, Melissa. My mom chokes. Borrow the car? I thought you gave up driving. He gives her a look. Things have changed, and I have some errands to run. Well, you can't drive my car, she replies slowly. You're not old enough. He sits up to his full height. I certainly am old enough. Would you like to see my driver's license? Dad, she says, her tone placating, what would happen if you were stopped? You don't exactly look like your driver's license. She's right. With his zits and his long hair falling out of his ponytail holder, he barely looks old enough to get into a PG-13 movie. I won't get stopped, he says. I remember how you drive. You always try to pass from the right lane, she says with a groan. I get more swing that way, he says. Simple physics. You're going to end up in an accident. His gaze hardens. Accident? You want to talk about accidents, Melissa? Who's the one who wrecked the Volkswagen? Who wrapped it around a tree? It wasn't my fault, she stammers. It was raining. The road was slick. It was dark. I'd just paid that car off. They stare at each other like bulls in a ring. I need to borrow the car, he says. My mom wouldn't let him borrow the car. Do you have any idea how many times she borrowed my car? He rants on the bus ride to school. He's furious. Why don't you just ask her to drive you there? I suggest. She won't drive me back to the lab, he says. The rent-a-cop told her he'd press charges if he saw me on the premises again. Oh, I say. I see his point. But on the bus after school, his mood is completely different. He seems almost happy, excited even. When we reach our stop, he doesn't get off. Come on, this is us, I tell him. He doesn't move. We're getting off at a different stop today. We are? Where? His eyes gleam. My lab.